The courtroom smelled of old wood and paper and something bitter underneath, like the air itself had been holding its breath for too long. Ethan Mercer stood behind a table he had never asked to stand behind in a room built for arguments he had never wanted to have. His hands rested flat against the surface, palms down, fingers spread the way a man steadies himself when the floor has started to tilt and he does not want anyone else to notice. He wore his Navy working uniform, the Type 3 long-sleeve blouse in AOR2 woodland digital camouflage fitted clean across broad shoulders that had carried men out of fire and smoke in places most Americans would never see on a map. Brown combat boots planted on the courtroom tile like roots, refusing to be pulled. His stern, angular face held no expression that could be named, but behind those steel blue eyes, something was burning, controlled and quiet and dangerous in the way only restrained fury can be. Across the aisle, a man in a charcoal gray suit sat with one ankle crossed over the opposite knee as if this were a restaurant and he was waiting for wine. His smile did not reach his eyes. It never did. Garrett Rennick. The judge spoke, but the words blurred beneath the pulse in Ethan's temples because 6 weeks ago, he had not known this room existed. 6 weeks ago, he had not known this man's name. 6 weeks ago, he was just a broken soldier driving through a blizzard with no destination and no reason to stop. But sometimes God places a miracle right where we almost keep driving. And when Ethan Mercer saw a mother shielding her baby with her last breath of strength on a frozen mountain road above Silver Creek, Colorado, he stopped. That single choice changed everything. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. Now let me take you back to the night it all started. The wind moved like a living thing along the ridgeline above Silver Creek, Colorado. It did not blow so much as hunt, dragging thin, sharp sheets of powder across a narrow mining road that twisted between frost-laden pines and abandoned rock cuts, whipping through gaps in the tree line with a sound like fabric tearing slowly in the dark. Down below the town's few streetlights glowed like distant embers swallowed by the storm's blue-gray breath, and beyond them, nothing. Just mountains folding into sky, all of it erased by snowfall so dense it turned the world into a single shade of white that was not white at all, but the cold, pale color of forgetting. This was the kind of winter evening where the mountains did not simply get cold. They erased color. They erased sound. They erased the illusion that anything fragile could survive without help. Ethan Mercer drove with both hands fixed on the wheel, his posture disciplined even in solitude. A rugged, middle-aged man of 39 with a compact athletic build that carried strength without excess, tall and broad-shouldered, beneath the full Navy working uniform, Type 3 long-sleeve blouse, and matching trousers in AOR2 digital camouflage. The green woodland pattern fitted properly, as if he still answered to standards no one else could see, paired with standard brown military combat boots that had walked through sand and mud and blood on 3 continents before they ever touched Colorado snow. His stern, angular face was weathered by cold and time-realistic pores, and fine lines catching the passing headlight glow like a topographic map drawn by years of sleeping in places where sleep was a calculated risk rather than a comfort. Steel blue eyes held the quiet restraint that comes from surviving too many nights where emotions were liabilities, where feeling anything at all could cost a man his life or the life of someone standing next to him. His short ash-brown beard was touched with subtle gray at the jaw. His hair cut regulation short beneath a wool watch cap pulled low against the cold. And yet nothing in him looked relaxed. Not even alone in the cab of his truck. Not even 1,000 miles from any battlefield. He had left active duty, at least on paper. 2 years since the discharge papers were signed at Joint Base Lewis McChord. 2 years since the flight home from Bagram sitting in a transport seat that should have held Briggs or Cortland, both of them gone in a single IED blast on a road outside Kandahar that lasted less than 3 seconds and took everything that mattered in less than 2. Ethan had walked out of the smoke carrying Cortland's dog tags in his left hand and a ringing in his left ear that the doctors at Walter Reed said might fade with time. But the silence inside his head, the one that lived beneath the ringing, the one shaped like 2 empty chairs at a table that used to seat 3, that silence the doctors did not mention because there was no treatment for it and no timeline for its departure. The war had not left him, and the road did not ask him to explain that, which was why he kept driving roads like this. Roads that climbed into nothing. Roads where the only sound was wind and engine and the occasional groan of timber bending under the weight of ice. Roads where memories could be drowned if a man drove high enough and long enough and did not stop to think about why he was driving at all. The only voice that mattered sat in the passenger seat beside him. Ghost, his K9 partner. A working-line German shepherd in his prime. 4 years old, black and tan coat, dense and muscular beneath the cab's interior, light thick and rough around the neck where the fur grew heaviest, flecked now with melting snow from the brief moment Ethan had opened the door at the gas station 40 minutes ago. Legs powerful and spring-loaded with controlled energy, built for pursuit and takedown, but resting now with the disciplined stillness of a dog who understood the difference between waiting and wasting. Amber eyes alert with an intelligence that felt less like an animal's instinct and more like a teammate's awareness, tracking the world beyond the windshield with the same methodical sweep a sniper uses to clear a rooftop. Ears moving like antennas, rotating independently, cataloging sounds that human hearing would never register. Ghost had served with Ethan on his final 2 deployments. They had cleared buildings together in Helmand Province, walked point on night patrols through villages where every shadow could hold a weapon, and slept side by side in forward operating bases where the temperature dropped below 0, and the only warmth was shared body heat and trust. When the IED took Briggs and Cortland, Ghost had been 30 meters behind the blast radius, close enough to feel the concussion wave flatten his ears against his skull far enough to survive without visible injury. But dogs carry invisible wounds too. For weeks afterward, Ghost had refused to walk, point circling back to press his flank against Ethan's leg, as if confirming that at least one member of the team was still breathing. Now Ghost lay angled toward the passenger window, breathing slow and even, but every few seconds his nose lifted, sampling the air through the narrow crack Ethan always left open regardless of temperature. And Ethan watched him the way a man watches a compass when the map has stopped making sense. Because Ghost had saved him not only in combat, but in the dark months that followed. Not by pulling him from rubble, though the dog had done that too, but by staying near when the quiet inside Ethan's head turned from silence into something with teeth. By insisting with warm weight and steady gaze that Ethan still belonged to the living, even when Ethan himself was not convinced. He had not intended to drive this high tonight. He had left Pine Hollow without a plan, passing the cabin his grandfather built nearly 70 years ago, when silver mining still breathed faintly through the valley, its weathered boards and sagging porch, a monument to a family line that had thinned to just him. He had driven through town without stopping past the diner with its fogged windows, where old men nursed coffee and argued about nothing past the gas station with its blinking sign heading upward, as dusk collapsed into darkness, because the idea of destination felt like something other people earned. People who had not left teammates in the dirt. People who could close their eyes at night without hearing their names called through smoke. Ethan did not believe he had earned anything except the right to keep moving. The truck climbed slowly, tires crunching through fresh drift headlights, carving a narrow tunnel through the storm. The world beyond that cone of light was nothing but moving white and shadow pine branches bending under accumulation, the road narrowing with every switchback until it felt less like driving and more like threading a needle through the dark while the dark pushed back. And then Ghost changed, not jumping, not panicking, simply tightening into focus the way a soldier does when a sound lands wrong. Every muscle in the dog's body drew inward and locked his head, rotating toward the passenger window with mechanical precision, ears pitched forward, nostrils flaring in rapid controlled sequence. A low sound rose in his broad chest, not a growl of threat, but something older and deeper, a warning of presence, an alert that in Afghanistan would have made Ethan drop to one knee and reach for his rifle without a single conscious thought. Ethan eased off the gas, letting the truck roll, while his eyes swept the road's edge through the frantic rhythm of the wipers, searching for what Ghost had already found. At first it looked like debris. Near an abandoned ore cart half buried in drifts, a rusted metal frame jutting from the snow like the ribs of something long dead. But then there was movement, low to the ground. A trembling shape pressed against a splintered fence post, and a faint flicker of eyes that caught the headlights and held them with a question that needed no language to understand. Eyes that were not human, but filled with something that was. Ethan stopped the truck and turned off the engine, and the sudden quiet was so complete it made the wind sound louder, as if the storm leaned closer when machines stopped talking. He opened the door into the full bite of Colorado winter, the air snapping against his face like needles snow stinging his cheeks and catching in his lashes as he stepped down into powder that swallowed his boots past the ankle. He moved with cautious purpose, shoulders squared weight, distributed because he had learned in places far more dangerous than this that anything cornered could become lethal without warning. And yet, he also knew from those same places that danger and suffering often look identical from a distance, and the only way to know which one you are facing is to close that distance and find out. Ghost exited on the opposite side without command, circling in a wide practiced arc, positioning himself slightly ahead and to Ethan's right. Not lunging, not tense. Simply owning the space with the calm authority of a dog who had been trained not merely to react, but to assess to control a perimeter without aggression, to project safety by embodying it. What Ethan found beside the fence post stopped him the way only certain things can stop a man who has walked through the worst rooms on earth and come out the other side. A female German shepherd lay collapsed against the splintered wood. Adult and severely underfed, her ribs, visible beneath frost, stiffened fur that should have been thick and proud, but now clung in icy clumps to her sides like a coat 3 sizes too large for the body beneath it. Her black saddle was dulled by grime and snow, her tan legs trembling with the kind of fatigue that goes beyond physical exhaustion into something spiritual. Something that looks like a body deciding whether to continue the extraordinary effort of remaining alive. And looped around her left hind leg, cutting deep into raw, inflamed skin beneath matted fur, was a length of wire, not tangled by accident, not caught during a run through underbrush. The knot was deliberate, professional, The kind of knot a man ties when he wants something to stay exactly where he leaves it, and he does not care what it costs the thing that stays. Someone had tied this dog here on purpose. Someone had driven up this road and fastened her to this post and left her in a blizzard to die. Her eyes were the first thing that hit Ethan with force he did not expect. Not wild with aggression, not blank with the vacancy of an animal too far gone to register its own pain, but bright with desperate endurance, a gaze that had burned through all its fear and arrived at something beyond fear, something that looked like a final stand being held not for self-preservation, but for the tiny life pressed against her chest. Because beneath her body, tucked into the last pocket of warmth she possessed, was a single puppy, no more than 3 weeks old. So small it looked like a mistake against the enormity of the storm, a living thing that should not have been possible in a place this cold and this cruel. Dark brown and black coat, still soft and uneven with the formlessness of extreme youth, and across its tiny chest a pale streak that caught the headlight glow like a brushstroke of cream against shadow. The puppy's cry was thin and strained, pushed out through a body that barely had the strength to produce sound, yet stubborn in a way that defied every reasonable expectation. A refusal. A tiny, furious refusal to accept the verdict the mountain had handed down. The mother tried to shift to place more of herself between the puppy and this approaching stranger, but her limbs shook so violently that the movement became a collapse, reorganized, and she did not bark, did not snap, only lifted her head with a warning written in every line of her broken posture. A warning that said she had nothing left except willingness to die for what was underneath her, and if that was not enough, then nothing would be. Ethan lowered himself slowly. Shoulders turned to reduce his silhouette. One gloved hand extended, palm down, fingers loose. He did not speak, because in his experience, silence was often gentler than words thrown against wind, and because the things that mattered most between one living creature and another were rarely said aloud. Ghost stepped forward and placed himself between the mother and the dark unknown of the road behind them, his body a wall of trained composure. And the mother's ears twitched once, twice, and her nose flared weakly, reading the information that Ghost's calm presence was broadcasting. She understood on some level that lived beneath thought that this second dog was not a threat, that he was standing guard. And slowly, with the reluctance of an animal that had been given no reason to trust anything with 2 legs, her gaze returned to Ethan and stayed there, measuring him with amber eyes that had learned the hard way what human hands could do. Ethan reached for the wire. His fingers traced the knot, and the confirmation of what he already suspected arrived through touch. Tied tight. Tied with knowledge. Tied by someone who had done this before. He drew the small knife from his cargo pocket, the blade catching a brief flash of light, and cut through the wire with a single controlled motion that he felt in his wrist like cutting a suture. The wire fell into the snow with a dull metallic whisper, and the mother flinched. Not from pain, from release. As if her body had forgotten what it felt like to have something stop hurting. His fingers moved to her neck, and beneath the ice-crusted fur, he found what he was afraid he would find. A scar. Old and healed, but deep, worn into the skin by a heavy industrial collar kept too tight for too long. This was not a pet that had wandered away from a family. This dog had been property. Used in a system designed to extract value from living things until the living things had no value left, and then disposed of like broken equipment left at the side of a road where no one would look. Something shifted inside Ethan's chest. Not a thought. Something older. Recognition. He had seen men hold positions when retreat would have saved them. He had watched Cortland throw his body over a junior soldier 3 seconds before the blast, a choice made, without calculation, pure instinct shaped by love, rather than training. Ethan had called that courage then, and he would call it courage until the day he died. But here was the same thing in a starving dog on a frozen mountain road. A mother who had been tortured and abandoned and still chose to shield her child with her own failing body rather than use her last strength to crawl toward survival alone. The purity of it cracked something open in him that had been sealed shut since Kandahar. He opened his coat and lifted the puppy first, cradling her against his sternum with both hands, feeling the heartbeat flutter against his palms like a moth trapped under glass, insistent and fragile and furious. He tucked her inside the warmth of his uniform, one hand cupping her back, and the puppy's cry softened to a whimper, and then to a sound so small it was almost just breathing. And Ethan murmured something low and shapeless, the kind of sound a man makes when he has forgotten how to comfort, but the need to comfort has not forgotten him. He slid one arm beneath the mother's chest and the other under her hindquarters, and stood. She weighed almost nothing. A dog that should have been 60 pounds was perhaps 40. And the absence of weight was its own kind of violence evidence written in bone and hunger of what had been done to her over months or years. Ghost moved in tight flanking left, scanning the tree line and the road with disciplined vigilance, and together the three of them crossed through the swirling snow toward the truck, Ethan's boots punching through the crust with each step, the mother trembling against his arms, the puppy's warmth bleeding faintly through fabric against his chest. The cabin at Pine Hollow was cold and stale when they entered, the temperature inside nearly matching the storm outside. Ethan set the mother down on a folded wool blanket near the stone hearth, a thick old thing from the cedar chest that still smelled faintly of his grandfather's pipe tobacco and machine oil. Ghost took position between the door and the injured dog without being told. Ethan built a fire with the efficiency of long practice, and when the flames climbed and the room began to breathe with warmth, the light revealed the full extent of the wound on the mother's hind leg. He cleaned it with warm water, applied antiseptic, wrapped it in gauze from his field medical kit. The infection had already started. She had been tied out there for days, perhaps longer. He mixed warmed goat milk and fed the puppy with a syringe drop by a careful drop. She swallowed weakly, then stronger, and then her breathing stopped. Ethan pressed 2 fingers to the tiny chest and began compressions small and rhythmic, the same motion he had performed on a man named Briggs in a helicopter above Kandahar, while rotor wash scattered dust and blood pooled on the metal floor. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Ghost stood rigid, every fiber locked, watching. 5 seconds, 10, 12. The puppy gasped, coughed, cried. Ethan exhaled through clenched teeth and held her in his palm, and the heartbeat returned unsteady, but defiant, a flicker of life that refused to be extinguished. He named the mother Sable, for the dark warmth of a coat that suffering had not yet destroyed. He named the puppy Flicker, for a heartbeat that stuttered like a candle in a draft and burned on. He sat back against the hearth, with Ghost pressed into his leg, Sable breathing evenly on the blanket, Flicker's chest rising and falling inside the flannel-lined crate he had placed near the fire. The storm pressed against the windows, the flames snapped, and for the first time since the night in Afghanistan when 2 chairs became empty and the silence moved in to stay, Ethan Mercer did not feel alone in the dark. But as the fire burned low and the cabin settled around him, questions remained in the smoke. The wire had been tied with professional knots. The scar on Sable's neck told the story of years in industrial captivity. Her body carried the evidence of repeated forced breeding. Someone had used this dog until she broke and then left her on a mountain to disappear. And whoever that someone was, they had gone to deliberate lengths to make sure she would never be found, which meant they had something to hide. And they were close enough to Silver Creek to know exactly which roads no one travels in winter. 3 days passed, and the cabin at Pine Hollow became something it had not been in years. Alive. Not loudly or dramatically alive, not the way a house full of children and laughter and Sunday morning arguments is alive, but alive in the quieter way that matters more to those who have known true emptiness. Alive in the sound of a fire that someone tends because other living things depend on its warmth. Alive in the click of small claws on wooden floorboards. Alive in the steady breathing of creatures that were not breathing 3 nights ago. Flicker had grown stronger with a speed that seemed to defy the math of her circumstances. She was still impossibly small, still more stumble than stride, but the stumbling now carried intention behind it, a tiny body learning the physics of its own legs with the furious concentration of someone who has somewhere to be and no patience for the process of getting there. Her dark coat had begun to show its true pattern, the black and brown deepening into definition, and the pale streak across her chest caught the firelight each morning like a signature written in milk. She had discovered Ghost on the 2nd day and decided immediately that he was the most important thing in the universe, launching herself at his broad flank with ambushes so clumsy and so committed that the massive shepherd would lower his head and hold perfectly still amber eyes, patient and watchful, allowing the puppy to climb across his shoulder and tumble down his opposite side without so much as a twitch of irritation. It was not indulgence. It was the composure of a working dog who understood instinctively that small things needed room to be reckless before they could learn to be careful. Sable healed more slowly, as mothers do, because mothers spend their recovery watching everyone else before attending to themselves. Her hind leg remained wrapped, the swelling reduced, but not gone, and she moved with a measured limp that favored the injury without surrendering to it. Her coat began to show the faintest return of luster, and she would hold still each evening while Ethan brushed the grime from her fur. Her amber eyes tracking his hand, with an attention that was not fearful but evaluative, the gaze of an animal relearning what gentle contact feels like after years of knowing only the other kind. Ethan fell into a rhythm that he did not name, because naming it would have meant admitting it mattered, and admitting things mattered was a risk he had spent 2 years avoiding. But the rhythm existed regardless of what he called it. Mornings splitting wood, feeding Flicker with the syringe that she now grabbed at with both front paws, as if wrestling a small enemy, checking Sable's bandage, letting Ghost run the perimeter of the clearing, while the sun broke pale and thin through the pines. Afternoons repairing warped boards on the porch, reinforcing the cabin's weathered frame against the next storm that was always coming in Colorado, and evenings by the fire, watching Flicker attempt increasingly ambitious assaults on Ghost's patience, while Sable rested nearby with the composed vigilance of a mother who has decided cautiously and provisionally that this place might be safe enough to close her eyes. For the first time in 2 years, Ethan had a reason to set an alarm. Not a mission, not a briefing. Just a puppy who needed to eat every 4 hours, and a mother dog whose wound needed checking, and a fire that needed to keep burning because 3 lives depended on its heat. And the simplicity of that responsibility The way it asked nothing of his past and demanded only his presence settled into him like water finding the lowest point in uneven ground. On the fourth morning, he loaded Sable into the truck and drove down to Silver Creek. Ashford Veterinary Clinic sat on the east end of Main Street, a modest building with 2 exam rooms and a small recovery kennel, its sign hand painted in green letters that had faded unevenly in the mountain sun. The bell above the door chimed as Ethan stepped inside. Ghost entering first with controlled precision black and tan coat, catching the fluorescent light, amber eyes sweeping the unfamiliar space before positioning himself slightly ahead, and to Ethan's right in the formation that was as natural to both of them as breathing. In Ethan's arms, Flicker was wrapped in a folded blanket, her pale chest streak visible against dark fur, her breathing shallow but steady. Behind him, Sable moved with her guarded limp head held high with the dignity of a dog who had endured more than she should have and intended to walk through doors on her own terms. Claire Ashford came around the counter without hesitation. She was in her early 30s, tall and lean auburn hair gathered into a loose braid over one shoulder. Sharp green eyes that had learned to read fear in animals before it turned into panic, assessing Sable's gait and Ethan's field dressing and Ghost's positioning all in 3 seconds, without any of it reaching her expression. Her movements were efficient and precise, in a way shaped not just by training, but by grief, converted into purpose. "Let's get them warm and take a look," she said, and there was no awe in her tone, no performative sympathy, only the steady, practical calm of a woman who had spent years reaching into the suffering of creatures that could not explain where it hurt. She knelt beside Sable on the exam mat, her long fingers moving gently through the fur around the bandage, and Ethan watched her note the precision of his field dressing with a slight nod that acknowledged competence rather than praising it. When she peeled back the gauze, the wound was angry, but contained red edges, inflamed yet clean where antiseptic had been applied. "You did good work here," she said, without looking up. "Military, Navy," Ethan said. Claire did not ask which branch or which war or how long. She simply continued working, cleaning the wound with measured care, applying a stronger antibiotic ointment, rewrapping the leg more securely, while explaining each step in a voice meant not for Ethan, but for Sable. Because Claire had learned long ago that transparency builds trust, and trust is the only way to reach a wounded animal without breaking it further. Then she ran a scanner over Sable's shoulder and the device beeped. Claire frowned. She ran it again, looked at the screen, ran it a third time with the scanner angled differently, pressing it more firmly against the skin beneath Sable's fur. "She has a microchip," Claire said slowly. "But the registration data has been wiped." She looked up at Ethan, and for the first time, her professional composure shifted into something sharper. "That is not something that happens by accident. Someone with access to the database deliberately erased her identity." She continued the examination in silence for a long moment, her hands moving along Sable's abdomen, pressing gently, palpating with the focused attention of someone reading a story written in tissue and bone. When she finished, she sat back on her heels, and her green eyes held a clarity that was no longer clinical. "This dog has been bred repeatedly. Multiple litters back to back with no recovery time between cycles. Her uterine wall is compromised. Her calcium levels are depleted. She was not someone's pet that got lost." Claire paused, and the pause carried the weight of what she was about to say. "She was inventory, used until she could not produce anymore, and then discarded. Ethan, this dog, came from a puppy mill." The words landed in the small exam room like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples spread outward into silence. Ethan looked at Sable, lying on the table, her amber eyes watching him with the steady patience of an animal that had stopped expecting kindness, and was slowly, carefully learning to accept it again. The wire, the professional knots, the industrial collar scar, the erased microchip. Each detail a sentence in a story that no one had intended him to read. But he had read it, and now he could not unread it. A 12-year-old tabby cat named Mr. Pemberton watched the entire scene from behind the bars of his kennel cage, his graying whiskers twitching with the permanently skeptical expression of a creature who had seen too many sad stories walk through that door and knew that most of them did not end the way people hoped. Claire handed Ethan a small packet of medication and instructions, written in careful script, her handwriting neat and deliberate, and told him to bring Sable back in a week, unless something changed. They were standing near the front counter when the bell above the door chimed again, and a man walked in who made the room feel smaller simply by entering it. Garrett Rennick was in his late 40s. Tall, but not imposing in the physical sense, his authority coming not from size, but from the particular stillness of a man who had learned that control was more effective than force. He wore a charcoal gray overcoat that fit too well for Silver Creek leather gloves, the color of espresso, and shoes that had never touched unpaved ground. His face was clean-shaven jaw, suggesting decisions made quickly and without regret, and his eyes were a pale gray that held warmth the way a frozen lake holds warmth, which is to say, technically, somewhere far below the surface, inaccessible to anything standing on top of it. He smiled when he entered. The smile was perfect. It was also empty. "Dr. Ashford," he said, and his voice was smooth and unhurried, the voice of a man accustomed to rooms going quiet when he spoke. "I am Garrett Rennick. I recently purchased the Holloway property east of town. I will be establishing a licensed canine breeding facility, and I would like to discuss veterinary services for the operation." Claire's expression did not change. But Ethan, who had spent 15 years reading micro-expressions in environments where a misread could be fatal, saw the shift in her shoulders. A tightening, not fear. Recognition of something she could not yet name. "Of course," Claire said evenly. "You can schedule a consultation through the front desk." Rennick nodded, still smiling. And then his gaze moved past Claire toward the hallway that led to the recovery room. The door was ajar. Through the gap, Sable was visible on the exam mat, her black and tan coat unmistakable, her bandaged leg resting on the blanket Ethan had brought. Rennick's eyes changed. It lasted less than a second. A flicker of recognition that moved across his pale gray irises like a shadow passing behind glass there and gone so quickly that anyone not trained to watch for exactly that kind of involuntary response would have missed it entirely. But Ethan did not miss it. And Ghost, standing at Ethan's right, did something he had not done since their last deployment in Kandahar. He growled. Low and controlled, barely audible above the hum of the heating system, but unmistakable in its meaning. Not aggression. Assessment. Ghost was cataloging Rennick, filing him in the same mental architecture that held every human the dog had ever identified as a source of wrongness, the kind of wrongness that does not announce itself with weapons, but with the particular stillness of a predator wearing civility as camouflage. Rennick glanced at Ghost with the practiced disinterest of a man who did not consider animals worthy of his attention, nodded once to Claire, and left. The bell chimed behind him. The room exhaled. Claire stood motionless for several seconds after the door closed. "That man," she said quietly, and then stopped. She turned to Ethan. "The Holloway property has been vacant for 2 years. Before that, It was a breeding operation that was shut down by the state for animal welfare violations. She paused. He is reopening it. Ethan said nothing. He watched the door where Rennick had stood, and the space still felt occupied the way a room feels after a sound too low to hear has passed through it. That same afternoon, another face entered the story that would wind itself around Silver Creek, like the wire that had wound around Sable's leg. Declan Pryor pushed through the clinic door, carrying a cardboard box with both hands, his tall frame slightly stooped from the weight of something heavier than the box itself. He was in his early 40s, sandy brown hair beginning to thin at the temples, wire-rimmed glasses sitting slightly crooked on his nose. His shoulders had the lean outline of a man whose body had been quietly consumed by months of sleepless nights, and the particular erosion that grief performs on men who refuse to ask for help. He taught history at Silver Creek High School, the kind of teacher who stayed late and remembered birthdays and kept a jar of butterscotch candies on his desk, because his late wife Margaret had always believed that small kindnesses accumulated into something larger than any single grand gesture. Margaret had died 2 years ago from an illness that moved faster than the doctors could explain, leaving Declan with a kitchen that still smelled like her lavender hand soap and a stack of medical bills that had since become foreclosure notices. Inside the box was a rabbit, small gray, trembling with a torn ear that one of his students had brought to him, because the students knew that Mr. Pryor was the person you brought broken things to when you did not know where else to go. Claire took the rabbit gently and examined it, while Declan stood with his hands empty and his eyes fixed on the middle distance. And Ethan recognized the posture immediately because he had seen it in the mirror every morning for 2 years. The posture of a man standing upright through willpower alone, holding everything together by refusing to acknowledge that everything was falling apart. Later, after Declan had left and the rabbit was resting in a small kennel with clean bedding and a heat pad, Claire sat on the edge of the exam table and looked at Ethan with an expression that was no longer professional. It was personal. "My fiancé," she said. Joel. He was a volunteer with the Mountain Wildlife Protection League. He spent his weekends documenting conditions at breeding operations and filing reports with the state. She paused, and the pause was long enough that Ethan understood she was deciding how much to give him, how far to open a door she had kept sealed for 3 years. Joel believed there was a large-scale operation in this region that was cycling dogs through faster than the state could track. He was collecting evidence, building a case. Another pause. He died 3 years ago. Climbing accident on Elk Ridge, the North Face. She said it the way people say things they have said many times before, with the words worn smooth by repetition until they no longer carry the texture of what actually happened, only the shape of it. Ethan inclined his head slightly. He did not offer condolence because he had learned that condolence from a stranger often feels like a door closing rather than opening. "The man who just walked in here," Ethan said slowly. "Rennick." He looked at Sable like he recognized her. Claire's green eyes held his for a long moment. "I know," she said. The bell above the door did not chime again that afternoon. But that evening, Claire's phone rang at the clinic. The caller identified himself as a legal representative of Garrett Rennick's business interests and inquired in language that was polite, in the way a scalpel is polite about a German shepherd reportedly receiving treatment at Ashford Veterinary Clinic, specifically requesting confirmation of the animal's status and current custodian. Claire hung up without providing any information, but the question had been asked. And questions from men like Garrett Rennick were never simply questions. They were the first notes of a song that always ended the same way, with someone losing something they thought was theirs. The nightmare came at 2:17 in the morning, as it always did, not with the courtesy of a gradual descent, but with the violence of a trap door dropping open beneath the floor of sleep. Ethan was in the vehicle again, the MRAP rolling through dust the color of bone bricks, telling a story about his daughter's first bicycle, Cortland, up front working his jaw on a piece of gum. And then the sound. Not an explosion the way movies show explosions, but a compression, a flattening of the air itself, as if the atmosphere had been seized by an invisible hand and squeezed until everything inside it broke. The MRAP lifted, and Briggs's story ended in the middle of a word that would never be finished. And the dust that came through the shattered windshield tasted like copper and chalk, and the end of something that could not be reassembled. Ethan woke with his hands locked around nothing, fingers, white arms rigid, his body curled against the headboard of the narrow bed in the cabin's single bedroom. His breathing came in short, sharp pulls that sounded like a man who had been held underwater and had just broken the surface. Sweat soaked the collar of his thermal shirt, despite the cold that had crept into the cabin as the fire burned low. Ghost was already there, not barking, not pacing, simply pressing his muzzle into the center of Ethan's chest with firm, steady pressure. His amber eyes locked onto Ethan's face with an intensity that said, "I am here and you are here, and whatever just happened inside your head is not happening outside of it." The dog's breathing was deliberately slow, a rhythm Ghost had learned or perhaps had always known, a biological metronome offering Ethan a tempo to follow out of the wreckage of the dream and back into the room. Ethan placed one shaking hand on Ghost's neck and gripped the thick fur and held on. Sable stood in the doorway. She had limped from her blanket near the hearth to the bedroom threshold and stood there without entering, her amber eyes watching Ethan with an expression that held no fear of his distress, no impulse to flee from the ragged sound of his breathing. Instead, there was something that looked impossibly like understanding. The recognition of one damaged creature watching another damaged creature do what damaged creatures do in the dark, which is shake and sweat and grip whatever is closest and wait for the shaking to stop. And then Flicker appeared. Tiny and unsteady, she had followed her mother to the doorway and now pushed past Sable's front legs and crossed the room with the blind confidence of a creature too young to understand what fear looks like in a grown man. She reached the bed and attempted to climb onto it. Failed, attempted again, failed again, and then looked up at Ethan with a sound that was half bark and half complaint. And the absurdity of it, the smallness of it, the sheer unreasonable stubbornness of a 3-week-old puppy demanding to be lifted onto a bed while a grown man fell apart, broke through the nightmare's grip in a way that no medication and no therapy session and no amount of driving empty roads had ever managed. Ethan reached down and lifted Flicker onto the mattress, and she crawled into his lap and pressed her face against his stomach and went still, her heartbeat tapping against his thigh like a small fist knocking on a door. 3 living things around him. Ghost against his chest. Sable in the doorway. Flicker in his lap. And the silence that followed was not the dangerous silence that lived inside his head, not the empty silence shaped like 2 missing men, but a different kind entirely. A silence with weight and warmth and breath in it. A silence that said, "You are not carrying this alone, even if you have not yet admitted you were carrying it." The next evening brought the season's second storm. It came faster than the forecasts predicted, the sky darkening not gradually, but with intent clouds rolling down from the Rockies like a second ridge descending on the valley. Ethan stood on the porch, securing a tarp over the woodpile, when Ghost's body changed in the way Ethan had learned to trust more than any instrument or broadcast. The dog's muscles locked, his head snapped toward the narrow road below the property, and his low alert rumble carried through the wind like a frequency only Ethan was tuned to receive. Headlights, cutting erratically through the white. A pickup truck fishtailing on the icy switchback where the road narrowed dangerously close to the ravine that dropped 200 feet into pine-choked darkness. Ethan moved without hesitation. He got Sable and Flicker inside, secured the cabin, and ran for the road with Ghost already bounding ahead. The truck had come to a violent stop with its rear wheel hanging over the edge engine, screaming the driver, fighting a door jammed shut by a wall of compacted snow. Behind the wheel, Declan Pryor sat with his face white and his hands locked on the steering column, glasses, crooked, sandy hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. But his fear was not for himself. His eyes kept darting to the truck bed where a wooden crate rattled and shook with the panicked movement of 3 rabbits he had been transporting to a shelter in the next county. 3 animals he had promised his late wife he would care for, because Margaret believed that small acts of mercy were the only kind of prayer that God could hear with certainty. Ethan secured a tow line, gave short, direct instructions that cut through panic, and pulled the truck back onto solid road, while Ghost positioned himself between the vehicle and the drop like a living anchor. The truck lurched forward. The tires caught. Declan exhaled a sound that was not a word and not a sob, but something between the two that men make when they realize how close they came to losing everything because they were too proud to wait. They carried the rabbits into the cabin, 3 small bodies trembling in their crate near the hearth. Ethan set them close to the fire, and Declan stood dripping and shaking, watching as Flicker approached Ghost and curled against the big shepherd's chest like a question mark tucked into an answer, and something in Declan's expression shifted in the firelight. The rigid pride that had kept him upright through months of foreclosure notices and empty evenings loosened. Not broke, loosened. The way a fist loosens when the thing it was protecting is no longer inside it. Mrs. Edith Cormack arrived the next morning without invitation, the way she had been arriving at doors across Silver Creek for 40 years. A widow in her late 60s with silver hair pinned beneath a knitted cap, blue eyes bright with the sharp intelligence of a woman who had buried a husband, raised 3 children alone, and decided that waiting for permission was a luxury she could not afford. She carried a casserole and 2 blankets, walked into the cabin as if she had been expected, set the food on the counter, assessed the room with a single sweeping glance, and sat down in the chair nearest the hearth with the authority of a woman who intended to stay exactly as long as she decided was necessary. My husband Edmund died in the Westfall mine collapse in '94. She said, not as introduction, but as foundation. 300 feet underground. They did not recover him for 11 days. She looked at Ethan with eyes that held no self-pity, only the bedrock clarity of someone who had walked through the worst door life could open and come out the other side still standing. Grief does not kill a man, Ethan. Isolation does. Grief just makes isolation feel like the right choice. Ethan did not respond, but he did not ask her to leave. And in the economy of Pine Hollow, that was enough. Claire arrived that afternoon to check Sable's wound. She stayed longer than the examination required, and when the bandage was fresh and Sable was resting near the fire, Claire sat on the porch step beside Ethan, while Ghost lay between them, and the last winter light stretched thin across the valley. Joel kept a journal, Claire said. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness cost her something visible. He documented everything he found about the breeding operations in this region. Dates, locations, numbers of animals. He believed there was one operation larger than anything the state agencies knew about. He was building a case for federal authorities. She paused. The wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant water. I have the journal. It is in a box in my closet with his climbing gear and his ring and the shirt he wore the last morning I saw him. Another pause longer. I have never been able to read past the first 20 pages. Ethan watched the valley and did not turn to look at her because he understood that some things are easier to say when the person listening is not looking directly at you. The man who walked into your clinic, he said. Rennick. Joel was investigating someone, and now that same kind of operation is being rebuilt on the same piece of land. Claire was quiet for a long time. I know, she said. If Joel was close to something, Ethan continued, and the person he was investigating knew it, then the timing of his death is not something I would call coincidence. Claire's breathing changed, barely perceptible. But Ethan heard it the way he heard every sound that carried information, because in his world, the difference between a breath that trembles and a breath that does not has been on more than one occasion the difference between a situation that is stable and one that is about to become catastrophic. I know, Claire said again. And this time, the words were not agreement. They were admission. The acknowledgement of a thought she had carried alone for 3 years, without ever speaking it aloud because speaking it would make it real. And making it real would mean that the accident that killed the man she loved might not have been an accident at all. The journal, Ethan said. Will you read it? Claire looked down at her hands. They were still, steady. The hands of a surgeon who had sewn wounds closed on hundreds of animals without trembling. But something behind her green eyes was shaking. Not yet, she whispered, but soon. Ghost shifted between them, pressing his shoulder against Ethan's knee and his flank against Claire's boot, connecting them through the simple language of a body that refused to let the space between two people become a distance. And Ethan understood, sitting on that porch with the cold pressing against his face, that this road above Silver Creek had stopped being about a wounded dog and a blizzard and a man trying to outrun silence. It had become about something buried, something someone had gone to great lengths to keep in the ground, and the digging had already begun. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered not by the postal service, but by a man in a dark blue sedan who drove up the ridge road to Pine Hollow, stepped out in a wool coat that was too thin for the altitude, and handed Ethan a manila envelope with the expression of someone completing a task he found distasteful, but not enough to refuse the pay. Ethan opened it standing on the porch with Ghost at his side and the cold pressing against his face like a flat palm. Inside was a formal demand on the letterhead of Rennick Agricultural Holdings, LLC, prepared by the law offices of Calder and Strauss in Denver, asserting legal ownership of one adult female German Shepherd registration number partially redacted formerly housed at the Holloway Creek Canine Facility and demanding the return of said animal within 14 days. Attached were photocopies of breeding registrations, purchase records, and a bill of sale dated 3 years prior, all bearing Garrett Rennick's signature in ink so precise it looked printed. A second page noted that any offspring produced by the animal during the period of unauthorized custody were also considered property of the registered owner under Colorado agricultural livestock statutes. Sable and Flicker, both of them, legally his. Ethan read the document twice, standing in the wind, and then folded it carefully along its original creases and placed it back in the envelope, and set the envelope on the porch railing where it sat like a small bomb waiting for someone to decide whether to defuse it or let it detonate. Ghost watched him with amber eyes that missed nothing. "I know," Ethan said quietly, and he went inside to call Claire. The news spread through Silver Creek the way news always spreads in small towns, not through announcement, but through accumulation. Claire told Declan when he brought the rabbit in for a follow-up. Declan mentioned it to Mrs. Edith Cormack when she stopped by the school to deliver mittens she had knitted for the third-grade classroom. Mrs. Cormack told Jed Thornberry at the hardware store while buying weather stripping, and Jed told his wife, who told the woman at the post office, who told someone at the diner, and by Wednesday evening, the entire town knew that the man on the ridge was being sued for keeping a dog he had pulled from a blizzard by someone who had left that dog to die. The reactions divided along a line that Ethan had seen before in other contexts in villages overseas where power determined allegiance and fear determined silence. Some people were angry on his behalf. Mrs. Cormack was among the first, her blue eyes sharp as winter glass when she arrived at the cabin with a second casserole and a declaration that had the structural integrity of a load-bearing wall. "I have lived in this town for 40 years, she said, standing in the doorway with snow in her silver hair and fury in her posture. "And I will not stand by while some man in a suit takes an animal from the persons who saved it. That is not how Silver Creek works, and it is not how I work." But others were quieter. The owner of the feed store on Main Street, who had initially welcomed Rennick's business with the pragmatism of a man whose margins were thin, found reasons to avoid the conversation. Two members of the town council who had attended Rennick's introductory luncheon at the Silver Creek Lodge and accepted his donation toward the new playground equipment suddenly developed a careful neutrality that looked less like fairness and more like calculation. Rennick was not merely a man with a lawyer. He was a man with money in a town that had very little of it, and money in small towns does not simply buy things. It buys silence. It buys hesitation. It buys the slow erosion of certainty in people who were sure of what was right until being sure became expensive. 3 days after the letter arrived, Claire's clinic received notification of a surprise compliance inspection from the State Veterinary Licensing Board, triggered by an anonymous complaint alleging improper record keeping and unsanitary conditions. Claire read the notice in her office with the door closed and her hands flat on her desk in a posture that mirrored Ethan's in the courtroom flash forward, the posture of someone absorbing an impact they saw coming but could not dodge. The inspection would take 2 weeks to schedule and complete. During that time, her ability to treat animals and maintain her practice would be under scrutiny that could, if the findings were unfavorable, result in suspension of her license. She called Ethan that evening. Her voice was controlled, professional, but beneath the control was the thin wire of anger that vibrates at a frequency only those who have been targeted by calculated cruelty can hear. "He is not just coming for Sable," Claire said. "He is coming for anyone who stands near her." Declan Pryor discovered the third prong of Rennick's reach on a Thursday afternoon when he sat down at his kitchen table to open the latest correspondence from First Mountain Savings and Loan regarding the foreclosure proceedings on his home. The letter contained a revised timeline accelerated by 60 days, citing a change in the bank's investment structure that required faster resolution of delinquent accounts. Declan read the letter 3 times before he noticed the name buried in the fine print of the attachment, a disclosure document listing the bank's recent capital partners. Among them, listed in small type on the second page, was a company called Rennick Agricultural Holdings, LLC. The man who wanted Sable was the same man whose money was now pushing Declan toward the street. It was not coincidence. It was architecture. The patient, methodical construction of pressure from multiple directions, each point of force appearing unrelated until you stepped back far enough to see the blueprint, and the blueprint was simple. Rennick wanted control, not of a dog, not of a clinic, not of a house. Of a town that might otherwise ask questions about what was happening inside the new facility on the old Holloway property, a facility whose construction crews worked behind privacy fencing and whose supply deliveries arrived in unmarked vehicles at hours when most of Silver Creek was asleep. Willa Kershaw was the one who provided the detail that connected the dots into a shape no one could ignore. She was in her late 20s. Auburn blonde hair cut just above her shoulders, hazel eyes that brightened when she smiled, but clouded easily when confronted with cruelty, and she worked part-time at the feed store while fostering stray cats no one else would claim. She had been delivering bulk orders to the old Holloway property before it was shut down 2 years ago, and she remembered the drives clearly because the sound that came from inside the buildings was not the sound of animals being cared for. It was the sound of animals being stored. Dozens of dogs, Willa told Claire in the back room of the clinic, her voice steady, but her hands wrapped around a coffee mug as if she needed something to hold. Crates stacked on crates. Almost no light. The smell was so strong I could taste it in the back of my throat on the drive home. She paused. I reported it once, to the county. Nothing happened. And then the place shut down on its own, and I thought it was over. It was not over. It had simply moved, and Sable, the dog Ethan had pulled from the snow with wire cutting into her leg, and a puppy pressed against her chest, was the living proof that it had existed at all. Claire opened the journal on a Sunday evening. She had kept it in a cardboard box on the top shelf of her bedroom closet for 3 years, alongside Joel's climbing harness. His carabiners still clipped to the webbing, his titanium wedding band in a small velvet pouch, and the flannel shirt he had been wearing the last morning. She saw him alive, the blue and gray one, with the frayed collar that still held beneath the cedar, and dust the faintest trace of the sandalwood soap he used. She had not opened the box since the week after the funeral, when she had placed each item inside with the careful deliberation of someone sealing a tomb, and closed the lid and pushed it to the back of the shelf and left it there while the seasons changed and the grief did not. But now she sat on the edge of her bed with the journal in her lap, and the weight of it was not physical. Joel Ashford had been methodical in the way that quiet men often are, the kind of meticulous that does not announce itself, but simply accumulates evidence, like snow accumulates on a ridgeline, gram by gram, until the weight becomes undeniable. His handwriting was small, and even each entry dated in the upper right corner, each observation numbered, each location noted with GPS coordinates that he had recorded on a handheld unit he carried on every hike. The first 20 pages Claire had read before. She knew them the way a person knows the opening paragraph of a letter they could not finish. Joel had documented 3 small breeding operations in the county, 2 of which were marginal and disorganized, the kind run by people who lacked resources rather than morals. But the third was different. The third was the Holloway Creek facility, and Joel's notes on it began with clinical observation and escalated page by page into something that read less like documentation and more like a man watching a crime unfold in slow motion and realizing that no one with the authority to stop it was willing to act. Dozens of dogs, German Shepherds primarily, but also Labradors and Golden Retrievers, breeds with high market value, housed in stacked wire crates with dimensions that violated Federal Animal Welfare Act minimums. Females bred every heat cycle with no veterinary oversight, no recovery period, no prenatal or postnatal care. Puppies removed at 4 weeks and shipped through a network of online brokers and pet stores across 6 states using falsified health certificates and fabricated breeder histories. Dogs that could no longer produce viable litters were, in Joel's words, removed from inventory. He did not specify how. He did not need to. The wire around Sable's leg and the frozen mountain road above Silver Creek told that story with a clarity that no journal entry could match. Joel had photographed the facility from the tree line on 4 separate occasions, using a telephoto lens from public land adjacent to the property. The photographs were tucked into the journal's back cover in a clear plastic sleeve printed on matte paper that had begun to curl at the edges. Claire spread them across the bed and looked at images her fiancé had risked his safety to capture. And what she saw was exactly what Willa Kershaw had described. Rows of crates, dim interiors, dogs standing on wire floors in spaces barely larger than their own bodies. But the photographs were not the revelation. The revelation was on page 47. Joel had written a single paragraph in handwriting that was less even than the pages before it, the letters slightly larger, the pen pressure heavier, as if the words had been produced under a kind of internal strain that changed the way his hand moved across paper. He knows I have been watching. I do not know how. Possibly cameras I did not see on the perimeter, possibly someone in town who reported my questions. I returned to the trailhead parking area on Wednesday and found that the locking carabiner on my lead rope had been replaced. The replacement is visually identical, but the gate mechanism is wrong. The spring tension is too light. Under real load, the kind of load that occurs in a fall on the north face of Elk Ridge, this carabiner would open. I am documenting this here because if something happens to me, I want there to be a record that I did not trust my own equipment on the last day I inspected it. I am going to climb anyway. The photographs from the eastern ridge line are the only angle that shows the interior loading bay, and without them, the file is incomplete. If I do not send this to the federal office by Friday, the window closes. I am aware of the risk. I am choosing to go. Claire read the paragraph once, then again, then a third time, while the room became very still around her, and the journal trembled in her hands, not from the weight of the paper, but from the earthquake happening inside her body. 3 years. For 3 years, she had grieved an accident. A terrible, random, senseless accident on a mountain that Joel had climbed dozens of times on a route he knew so well he could have navigated it blindfolded. For 3 years, she had told herself that the universe was simply cruel and that the man she loved had been taken by bad luck and gravity and the indifferent mathematics of rock and ice and human error. But it was not an accident. Joel had known. He had known before he clipped into that rope that someone had tampered with his gear. He had weighed the risk and chosen to climb because the evidence mattered more to him than his own safety, because the dogs inside those crates could not climb out on their own, and he believed that his photographs were the only things standing between them and another year of suffering. And he had been right. And he had fallen. And no one had read page 47 until now. Claire did not cry immediately. The tears came later after the shock receded enough to make room for them. What came first was something colder and harder and more clarifying than grief. It was the understanding that the man she had loved had not died because the world was random. He had died because someone with money and power and the willingness to tamper with climbing equipment had decided that Joel Ashford's compassion was a threat to profit and had removed that threat with the efficiency of a man removing inventory from a spreadsheet. Garrett Rennick had not merely operated a puppy mill. He had killed the man who tried to expose it. Or at the very least, he had created the conditions for that man's death and counted on the mountain to do the rest. Claire sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after she finished reading. The journal lay open on her lap, and the room was quiet in the way that rooms become quiet when something fundamental has changed inside them, when the air itself seems to reorganize around a new truth that takes up more space than the old one. She thought about the morning Joel left for Elk Ridge. She had made coffee. He had kissed her forehead and said he would be back by dinner. She had said something about picking up groceries, something ordinary, something that belonged to a world where climbing accidents were things that happened to other people. And the man you loved came home when he said he would. She had not known, standing in that kitchen with steam rising from her mug and sunlight on the counter, that she was living the last ordinary morning of her life. And she had not known until this moment 3 years later that the accident she had grieved was not an accident, but a choice made by a man in a charcoal suit who valued profit over human life, and calculated that a fall on a mountain would look like exactly what it was designed to look like. The tears came then. Not the tears she had cried at the funeral, which were the tears of loss and confusion and the terrible helplessness of a woman standing beside a casket that should not have been closed yet. These were different. These were the tears of someone who has been carrying a wound for years, and has just discovered that the wound was not caused by fate, but by a hand, a specific hand, attached to a specific man. And the discovery does not heal the wound, but gives it a direction, a name, a target. She cried for 11 minutes. She knew because the digital clock on her nightstand read 9:14 when she started and 9:25 when she stopped. And when she stopped, she washed her face and put the journal in her bag and picked up her keys. Claire drove to Pine Hollow through darkness so complete that her headlights felt like the only source of light remaining in the world. The road was empty. The trees stood like sentinels along both sides, their branches heavy with snow that had not yet decided to fall. She did not remember most of the drive because her body was operating on the autopilot of shock while her mind processed a new reality that had rewritten the last 3 years of her life in the space of a single paragraph. Ethan was on the porch when her headlights appeared. Ghost beside him, amber eyes catching the light. Sable visible through the open cabin door, standing alert at the threshold, ears forward, and Flicker's small shape pressed against her mother's front leg, like a shadow that refused to separate from its source. Claire climbed the porch steps and handed Ethan the journal without speaking. Her hands were steady. The steadiness was not calm. It was the rigid composure of a woman holding herself together by force of will alone, the way a cracked dam holds water, not because it is strong, but because it has not yet found the angle at which to break. Page 47, she said. Her voice did not crack. It did not need to. The 2 words carried everything. Ethan opened the journal and read by the light of the porch lantern while the cold turned his breath to vapor, and Ghost pressed warm against his leg. And the mountain night held its silence like a witness waiting to be called. Claire stood at the railing with her arms crossed over her chest, not from cold, but from the need to hold something together, and she watched the valley below, where the lights of Silver Creek flickered like a nervous system uncertain of its next signal. When Ethan finished, he closed the journal slowly and held it in both hands and looked at Claire. And for a long moment, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing to say that was adequate to the weight of what they now carried together. The wind moved through the pines. The fire inside the cabin popped and sent a brief shower of sparks up the chimney. Ghost's ears rotated toward a sound in the distance that neither human could hear, cataloged it, dismissed it, returned to stillness. Then Ethan said, "I am not giving him Sable," and Claire, whose grief had just been transformed from sorrow into something with edges and purpose and a target, looked at him with green eyes that were no longer soft with pain, but sharp with the kind of resolve that only arrives when a person discovers that the thing they have been mourning was not lost, but taken. "And I am going to find out what happened to Joel," she said. The fire inside the cabin crackled. Ghost exhaled slowly. Sable stood in the doorway with Flicker pressed against her front leg, the puppy's pale chest streak catching the lantern light like a small flag planted in territory that had just been claimed. And the story that had begun as a rescue in a blizzard became something else entirely, because the question was no longer whether Sable and Flicker would survive. The question was whether Ethan Mercer, a man who had spent 2 years running from everything, would finally stop running and stand his ground against a man who had proven he was willing to destroy anyone who stood in his way. And somewhere in the dark on the old Holloway property east of town, behind privacy fencing and locked gates, dozens of dogs waited in crates they could not open in silence. They could not break for someone to come. Garrett Rennick came to Pine Hollow on a Thursday afternoon, uninvited and unhurried the way a man arrives when he wants the act of arrival itself to be the message. His dark blue sedan climbed the ridge road with steady patience, and Ethan saw it from the porch, where he had been replacing a warped board. Ghost saw it first, of course. The dog shifted from resting alertness into operational stillness 3 seconds before the sedan rounded the last curve. Amber eyes locking onto the vehicle with flat, unblinking assessment. Rennick parked at the edge of the clearing and stepped out alone. No lawyer, no sheriff's deputy, just the man himself in his charcoal overcoat and leather gloves. His pale gray eyes sweeping the property with the appraising satisfaction of someone surveying an acquisition rather than visiting a home. He closed the car door with a soft click and walked toward the cabin with his hands in his pockets, and that smile already in place, the one that functioned less as an expression of pleasure and more as a tool of positioning, a way of establishing that he was comfortable and you should be concerned about why. Ethan descended the porch steps and stood in the clearing with Ghost at his right. He did not cross his arms. He did not widen his stance. He simply stood with the economical stillness of a man who had learned that posture communicates more than words, and that the person who moves first in a confrontation has already conceded something. "Mr. Mercer," Rennick said, stopping 8 feet away with the precision of a man who understood personal space as a negotiation tactic. His voice carried the same smooth, unhurried quality it had held in the clinic, the voice of boardrooms and depositions and conversations designed to feel civil while communicating threat. "I thought we should speak directly, man to man, before the attorneys turn this into something longer and more expensive than it needs to be." "You drove up here to tell me that," Ethan said. "It was not a question." "I drove up here because I believe in resolution," Rennick said. "I am a businessman. Litigation is overhead. And frankly, this matter is simple. The dog is registered to my facility. The paperwork is clear. You found her in distressed circumstances, and I appreciate the care you have provided, but the law is the law, and ownership is ownership, and I would prefer to resolve this without a judge telling you what I am telling you now." Ethan watched him the way he had watched men in interrogation rooms in Afghanistan, with the patient focus of someone cataloging every micro-expression, every shift in weight, every word that was chosen, and every word that was avoided. Rennick stood with his weight balanced, his hands still pocketed his chin, slightly elevated, and everything about him projected the confidence of a man who had never encountered a situation his money could not shape. The dog was tied to a fence post with industrial wire. Ethan said, his voice low and level. In a blizzard, with a 3-week-old puppy underneath her. The wire had cut through the skin to the muscle. She had not eaten in days. He paused. That is not distress circumstances. That is disposal. Rennick's smile did not waver. Animals escape. Animals wander. I cannot account for every incident that occurs on open range in winter. What I can account for is the documentation that proves she was bred and raised at my facility and under Colorado statute that makes her my property. Your property? Ethan repeated. The words sat in the air between them like a held breath. Yes. Ghost had not moved, but the quality of his stillness had changed in a way that only Ethan could read. A tightening of the muscles along the shoulders, a slight forward shift of weight onto the front paws. The controlled preparation of a dog who was not yet reacting but was ready to react in less time than it takes a human heart to beat once. He was watching Rennick with the same fixed intensity he had used on targets in Helmand Province. And the fact that he had not growled, had not made a sound, was more significant than any bark would have been, because silence in a trained K9 is not passivity. It is the highest level of alert, the state that precedes action, and waits only for the signal. Rennick noticed the dog for the first time, or pretended to, and his gaze lingered on Ghost for a moment before returning to Ethan with an expression that recalculated something behind the pale gray eyes. You served, Rennick said. I respect that, and I understand that men who serve sometimes develop attachments that feel more important than they are. But sentiment is not a legal position, Mr. Mercer. And in 72 hours, the court order becomes enforceable. He paused, and the pause was deliberate, a space left open for his next words to fill with maximum impact. I would hate for your veterinarian friend to lose her license over a misunderstanding, or for the school teacher to lose his home over a matter of timing. Another pause. These things have a way of resolving themselves when reasonable people make reasonable choices. The threat was delivered with the same smooth tone as everything else, wrapped in language that could be denied in a courtroom but could not be misunderstood in a clearing on a mountain ridge. And then Rennick glanced past Ethan toward the cabin door, and what he saw there changed the shape of his expression for the second time since Ethan had known him, the first being the moment in Claire's clinic, when he recognized Sable through the recovery room door. Sable stood at the cabin threshold. She had come to the door on her own, drawn by a voice or a scent or something older than either, some recognition coded into the cells of an animal who had spent years inside a system built by the man standing in the clearing. She stood with her bandaged leg held slightly off the ground, her black and tan coat catching the winter light. Her amber eyes fixed on Rennick with an expression that Ethan had never seen on her face before. Not fear, not the desperate endurance of the night he found her. Something else, something that looked like memory arriving uninvited and bringing with it every room she had been locked in, every litter she had been forced to carry, every day she had spent as inventory in a ledger maintained by the man now standing 15 feet from the door she had learned to call safe. And then Sable did something that required no translation. She stepped backward, one step, then another, moving slowly, deliberately away from Rennick and deeper into the cabin, positioning herself behind Ethan's silhouette, as if drawing a line in the space between the man who had owned her and the man who had saved her. She chose, and Rennick saw it, His smile thinned. The pale gray eyes went flat for a fraction of a second, the way water goes flat before wind arrives, and then the composure returned smooth and practiced and impenetrable. And he nodded once, as if the conversation had concluded according to his plan. 72 hours, he said, and turned and walked to his sedan and drove down the ridge without looking back. The clearing was quiet after he left. The wind moved through the pines. Ghost exhaled slowly, and his body released from operational stillness into the looser posture of a dog who had assessed a threat and filed it, and was now waiting for the next instruction. Sable remained inside the doorway, her eyes still fixed on the place where the sedan had been. Ethan stood in the clearing for a long time. That night was the worst. The nightmare did not wait until 2 a.m. It came the moment Ethan closed his eyes, as if Rennick's visit had unlocked a door that his subconscious had been leaning against for weeks. The explosion was louder than it had ever been in the dream, the dust thicker, the smell sharper, and this time, when Ethan walked through the smoke, he did not find Briggs and Cortland. He found Sable, lying on a concrete floor in a wire crate too small for her body, her leg caught in a loop of industrial cable, and standing above her with a clipboard and a pen was a man in a charcoal overcoat who looked up at Ethan and smiled and said, 72 hours. And then the crate multiplied. Dozens of crates, hundreds, stacked to a ceiling that did not exist, each one containing a dog that was not barking, not crying, just looking at Ethan through the wire with eyes that asked the same question Sable had asked on the night he found her. Are you going to stop? Or are you going to keep driving? He woke, gasping, his body rigid, the sheets twisted around his legs like restraints. The cabin was dark. The fire had burned to embers that pulsed faintly like a heartbeat running out of time. And before his conscious mind could form a thought, his body was moving feet on the floor, boots pulled on without lacing coat, grabbed from the hook keys in his hand. He was going to drive. Get in the truck and drive down the mountain and keep driving until Pine Hollow and Silver Creek and the sound of Rennick's voice were behind him, because that was what he did. That was what he had always done. Since Kandahar, the ability to leave before the wait became unbearable. He reached the truck. He opened the driver's door, and Ghost was there. Not in the passenger seat where he usually rode, but standing on the ground between Ethan and the open door, forelegs planted, 80 pounds of trained muscle and loyalty and refusal. His amber eyes catching the faint light from the cabin windows and holding Ethan's gaze with an intensity that was not obedience and not command, but something between the two. Something that said, I have followed you through worse than this, and I am not going to follow you through running away. Ghost did not growl, did not bark, did not move. He simply stood where he stood and would not yield. And in the silence that followed, Ethan heard a sound from the porch. Sable had come to the door again, and she stood on the threshold with her weight on 3 legs, and her head raised, and her amber eyes steady, and behind her barely visible in the dark interior of the cabin. Flicker's small shape moved the pale streak on her chest, catching the ember light as she pressed against her mother's front leg, and looked out at the man who had saved them both, and was now standing in the snow with his keys in his hand, and nowhere to go. 3 living things between him and departure. 1 dog who had served beside him through war and refused to let him desert. 1 mother who had chosen him over the man who had owned her. 1 puppy whose heart he had restarted with his own fingers on a night when the storm was trying to erase every fragile thing on the mountain. Ethan's hand was still on the truck door. The keys were still in his other hand. And the choice was very simple and very clear and very heavy. He could drive. He could leave. He could do what he had been doing for 2 years, which was put distance between himself and anything that required him to stay and fight and risk losing again. Or he could close the truck door and walk back into the cabin and sit down by the dying fire and admit that the armor he had been wearing since Kandahar, the isolation he had called strength, the solitude he had called discipline, was not protecting him. It was killing him, slowly and quietly, and with his full cooperation. Ethan closed the truck door. He walked back to the porch. He sat down on the step. Ghost came and lay beside him, pressing his full weight against Ethan's leg with the deliberate firmness of a dog anchoring a man to the earth. Sable lowered herself to the threshold. Flicker crawled into Ethan's lap and curled into a ball so small and so warm that the weight of her felt like the opposite of everything he had been carrying. And Ethan Mercer, who had not cried since the night Briggs and Cortland died, lowered his head and wept. Not for long, not dramatically. The way a man weeps when the breaking has been happening for years, and the final crack requires only the smallest pressure to complete. The tears came, and he let them come, and Ghost stayed and Sable stayed, and Flicker slept through it with the supreme indifference of a creature too young to understand what surrender looks like in a grown man. And when it was over, the silence that followed was different from any silence Ethan had known since the war. It was not the silence of absence. It was the silence that comes after a held breath is finally released. He sat on the porch step until his breathing steadied and the cold made his cheeks ache and the first gray suggestion of dawn appeared at the eastern edge of the ridge. Then he went inside and picked up his phone and called Claire. Then Declan. "I have a plan," he said, "but this time I need people." The plan came together over 72 hours that felt simultaneously like minutes and years, compressed by urgency and stretched by the weight of what failure would mean. Ethan worked with the focused efficiency of a man running a mission, because that was what this was: not a military operation, but the civilian equivalent, a coordinated effort with defined objectives, distributed roles, and a timeline that would not negotiate. The objective was not violence. The objective was evidence. Enough evidence to give federal authorities grounds for an emergency warrant that would override Rennick's local legal maneuvering and expose the operation on the Holloway property before the 72-hour deadline turned Sable and Flicker into the legal possessions of the man who had tried to kill them. Ethan handled reconnaissance. He drove to the Holloway property at dawn on the first morning, parked on the public forest access road that ran along the eastern boundary, and spent 4 hours in the cold, with Ghost at his side, observing through binoculars from a position that was legal and documented. He noted the construction behind the privacy fencing, the ventilation units on the roof that indicated climate-controlled interior spaces consistent with large-scale animal housing, the pattern of vehicle arrivals and departures, 3 unmarked panel vans per day at intervals that suggested a distribution schedule rather than random traffic. Ghost sat beside him, with his nose working the wind, and at one point, the dog's body tightened in the way Ethan had learned to read as confirmation, the involuntary response of a canine olfactory system detecting concentrated animal presence at distance. There were dogs inside that building. Many of them. Claire worked the professional network. She called 11 veterinarians across Colorado, Wyoming, and Nebraska colleagues she had met at conferences and trusted with the kind of trust that is built not on friendship, but on shared professional standards. 3 of them had encountered Rennick's operation before in its previous locations under previous business names, and 2 had filed complaints that had resulted in enforcement actions that Rennick had evaded by closing one facility and opening another in a different jurisdiction, a shell game played with living creatures as the pieces. Claire compiled a timeline that spanned 5 years and 4 states, documenting a pattern of opening, operating, being reported, closing, relocating, and reopening. That was not the behavior of a legitimate breeder, but the business model of someone who understood exactly where the regulatory gaps were and how to move through them faster than the system could close them. Declan handled the paper trail with the quiet, methodical tenacity of a man who had spent 20 years teaching students to trace cause and effect through historical documents. He went to the county recorder's office and pulled incorporation records for Rennick Agricultural Holdings, LLC, and its subsidiaries, cross-referencing addresses and officer names with the timeline Claire had built. He found 6 shell companies, all registered within the past 5 years, all listing the same registered agent in Denver, all connected to properties that had housed breeding operations that had subsequently been cited closed or abandoned. The financial architecture was not sophisticated. It did not need to be. It only needed to be opaque enough to discourage anyone without the patience to trace every thread. And Declan Pryor had nothing but patience, because patience was the only resource grief had not taken from him. Willa Kershaw found the witness, a former employee of the original Holloway facility named Dale Scobie, a quiet man in his 50s who had worked as a kennel hand for 8 months before quitting without notice and moving to a trailer park outside Glenwood Springs, where he had spent 2 years trying to forget the things he had seen and failing. Willa found him through a mutual acquaintance at the feed store and drove 2 hours each way to sit at his kitchen table and listen while he described in a voice that cracked and recovered and cracked again the conditions inside the facility, the stacked crates, the females bred until their bodies gave out, the puppies taken at 3 weeks and crated for transport, and the dogs that stopped producing the ones Rennick called inventory, write-offs loaded into a truck at night and driven to remote locations and left. Dale had found wire in the truck bed, the same gauge, the same type. He had not needed to ask what it was for. Dale Scobie agreed to sign an affidavit. Mrs. Edith Cormack organized the community response with the commanding efficiency of a woman who had spent 4 decades running church rummages, school fundraisers, and emergency response committees in a town that was too small to delegate and too proud to ask for outside help. She collected signatures on a petition addressed to the county commission and the state attorney general, 47 names from a town of 400, each one representing a resident who had decided that silence was no longer a price they were willing to pay for stability. Jed Thornberry provided copies of building permits filed for the Holloway renovation permits that described the construction as agricultural storage, but whose specifications, when reviewed by a structural engineer, Jed knew from his years in the building supply trade, were consistent with large-scale animal confinement rather than crop or equipment storage. Joel's photographs were the final piece. Claire had them digitized and authenticated by a forensic imaging specialist in Denver, who confirmed that the metadata placed them at the coordinates Joel had recorded in his journal on the dates Joel had noted at a property that was now under Rennick's ownership and undergoing construction that matched the layout visible in the original photographs. The specialist also examined the images of Joel's climbing equipment, the carabiner photographs that Joel had taken before his final ascent, and noted that the gate mechanism visible in the image was inconsistent with the manufacturer's specifications for that model, a finding that was not conclusive but was significant enough to warrant further investigation by the appropriate authorities. The complete file assembled over 3 days by a veterinarian, a teacher, a feed store worker, a retired kennel, and a hardware store owner, a 67-year-old widow with a petition and a Navy SEAL who had finally stopped running, was transmitted to the Denver field office of the United States Department of Agriculture and the FBI's Animal Cruelty Task Force at 11:14 on the morning of the third day. The 72-hour deadline expired at 5 o'clock that afternoon. At 4:47, Ethan sat on the porch of the cabin at Pine Hollow with Sable leaning against his left leg and Flicker asleep in his lap, and Ghost stationed at the top of the steps facing the road, his amber eyes tracking the tree line with the composed vigilance of a dog who had stood watch 1,000 times before and intended to stand watch 1,000 times more. Claire sat beside Ethan on the step close enough that their shoulders touched, and neither of them spoke because the hours of action had given way to the hours of waiting. And waiting is a language that requires no words. The sun was low. The light on the valley was amber and gold. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Ethan said without turning to look at her, "I do not regret stopping on that road." Claire did not answer immediately. She reached down and rested her hand on Ghost's broad head, and the dog leaned into her palm with the easy trust of an animal who had decided in his own time and by his own judgment that this woman belonged to the unit. "Joel would have liked you," she said, and the evening settled around Pine Hollow with the particular stillness that precedes either storm or clearing, and neither of them could say which was coming, only that they would be standing on the porch when it arrived. The morning arrived with the kind of stillness that only follows a night spent waiting for something that cannot be rushed. Ethan was awake before the sun cleared the ridge. He had not truly slept, but he had rested the way soldiers rest before an Operation Body horizontal mine-running sequences. Ghost lay beside the bed ears rotating all night. Sable slept near the hearth with Flicker tucked against her chest, and the fire had burned down to coals that glowed like the last embers of a patience nearly spent. At 7:15, Ethan stood on the porch with coffee he did not taste and watched the road below. The sky was pale and clean, washed by a night of clear cold that had left frost on every surface like a thin layer of glass laid over the world. The valley below Silver Creek caught the first light in shades of amber and white, and the mountains beyond stood in the kind of sharp focus that Colorado produces when the atmosphere is too cold for haze. Every ridgeline and tree line and rock face rendered with the precision of something drawn by a hand that does not make mistakes. By 9 o'clock, the road began to fill. Mrs. Edith Cormack arrived first, driven by her neighbor's grandson, and stepped out with the petition folder under one arm and the expression of a woman whose mourning had exactly one purpose. Jed Thornberry followed in his flatbed broad shoulders, squared inside a canvas work coat. Declan Pryor came in his repaired pickup, carrying a leather satchel with copies of every corporate document and financial connection he had traced. Willa Kershaw brought Dale Scobie, the former kennel hand who held his signed affidavit against his chest with both hands. Behind them, more vehicles. Families from town. Students from Declan's history class. An older couple from the ranch south of town who brought nothing but their presence. By 9:30, 23 people stood in the clearing at Pine Hollow. Ghost stood at the top of the porch steps, amber eyes sweeping the assembly with the calm assessment of a dog who had spent his career distinguishing between hostile crowds and friendly ones. Sable had come to the doorway again, drawn by the sound of voices and engines, and she stood on the threshold with Flicker pressed against her front leg, watching the gathering with amber eyes that held no fear. Only the composed attention of a mother who has learned to evaluate every new situation through the single question of whether it threatens her child. Ethan stood among them without standing apart from them, and the difference between those two things was the distance he had traveled in 6 weeks. At 10 o'clock, a black SUV appeared on the Ridge Road, followed by a silver sedan. The SUV belonged to Rennick's attorney, a trim man in his 50s named Calder, who stepped out carrying a briefcase with the unhurried confidence of someone who had done this before and expected it to go the way it always went. The sedan belonged to a deputy from the county sheriff's office, a young man whose discomfort was visible in the way he adjusted his belt and avoided eye contact with the people he recognized from town. Rennick arrived last in his dark blue sedan, and when he stepped out and saw the clearing full of people, his expression performed a calculation that was visible for approximately 2 seconds before the smile returned. He straightened his charcoal overcoat and walked toward the cabin with Calder at his side, and the deputy trailing behind at a distance that suggested he would have preferred to be somewhere else entirely. Mr. Mercer. Calder began opening his briefcase with the practiced efficiency of a man who believed that paper was the most powerful weapon in any room. The 72-hour period has expired. We are here pursuant to the court's temporary order for the return of the animal designated in the filing. I would ask that you produce the animal voluntarily so that we can avoid the involvement of law enforcement. The deputy shifted his weight. Mrs. Cormack's blue eyes could have cut glass. Ghost had not moved from the top of the steps, but the quality of his stillness had shifted into the register that Ethan recognized as the final state before action, the state where the dog's body becomes a loaded system, waiting only for permission. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, and then a sound came from the road below that changed everything. 3 vehicles climbed the ridge in close formation. 2 white SUVs bearing the insignia of the United States Department of Agriculture Office of Inspector General, and 1 unmarked dark sedan. 4 agents stepped out, 2 men and 2 women, wearing tactical vests over civilian clothing, their movements coordinated and completely indifferent to the tableau of attorneys and deputies and townspeople that greeted them. The lead agent, a woman in her 40s with short brown hair and a face that communicated exactly zero interest in local politics, walked directly to Calder and produced a folded document. "Federal warrant," she said, "issued this morning by the United States District Court for the District of Colorado, authorizing search and seizure at the property known as the Holloway Creek Facility, currently operated by Rennick Agricultural Holdings, LLC, in connection with suspected violations of the Animal Welfare Act, the Lacey Act, and federal wire fraud statutes related to the interstate sale of animals under falsified documentation." She did not pause for reaction. She did not wait for Calder to read the warrant. She turned to Rennick, who stood very still in his charcoal overcoat, his pale gray eyes performing a rapid series of calculations that arrived for the first time in Ethan's observation at an answer he did not like. "Mr. Rennick," the agent said, "you are requested to accompany us to the Holloway Creek property to facilitate the execution of this warrant. Refusal to cooperate will result in additional charges." Rennick's smile was gone, replaced by nothing. The face behind the smile was blank and flat and cold, the face of a man who had run out of lies and had not yet decided what to replace them with. Calder began speaking in rapid legal terminology that no one was listening to because what mattered was already happening. The warrant was real, and the 72 hours Rennick had used as a weapon had expired into irrelevance. The clearing watched Rennick walk to the federal SUV and get inside without resistance. Calder followed in his sedan. The deputy drove down the ridge without speaking to anyone. The search of the Holloway Creek facility took 4 hours. What the agents found inside matched everything Joel Ashford had documented in his journal 3 years earlier, reconstructed with industrial efficiency on the same piece of land. 47 dogs. German shepherds, Labradors, golden retrievers, housed in stacked wire crates in a climate-controlled building behind the privacy fencing, females showing signs of chronic overbreeding, puppies in a separate wing awaiting transport, medical records that were either fabricated or non-existent, and a shipping manifest that documented sales to brokers in 9 states over the preceding 11 months. Garrett Rennick was arrested at 4:12 in the afternoon on the property he had built to replace the one Joel Ashford had died trying to expose. He was handcuffed beside the loading bay that Joel had photographed from the tree line, and as the agents walked him to the waiting vehicle, Rennick turned his head and looked east toward the ridge above Pine Hollow, where the cabin sat small and distant against the tree line. He could not see Sable from that distance, but Ethan liked to think he knew she was there, standing free, on ground that belonged to the man who had pulled her from the snow rather than the man who had put her in it. The ownership claim was voided that same day by emergency judicial order. Sable and Flicker were legally free, and the lead federal agent before leaving Silver Creek informed Claire Ashford that the investigation into the death of Joel Ashford on Elk Ridge had been formally reopened based on the journal evidence and the forensic analysis of his climbing equipment. The agent did not promise an outcome. She did not speculate on charges. She simply said, "We are looking at it now." And for Claire, who had spent 3 years carrying a grief built on a lie, those 5 words were enough to change the shape of the wound from something that ached without reason into something that ached with purpose. Claire stood in the clearing after the last federal vehicle departed, and she did not cry. She closed her eyes and tilted her face toward the sky and breathed in and breathed out. And when she opened her eyes, they were clear. "Thank you," she said to Ethan. And the words were not for the rescue of a dog or the assembly of a file or the coordination of a mission. They were for something simpler and harder than any of those things. They were for staying. Spring came to Pine Hollow the way it always comes to the Colorado high country, not as an announcement, but as a negotiation. Winter retreating in inches rather than miles, snow pulling back from the south, facing slopes first, and holding stubbornly in the shadows where the sun could not reach the streams, swelling with meltwater that ran clear and cold through channels that had been silent for months. The cabin looked different now. Not because the structure had changed, though the porch boards no longer creaked and the shingles held firm against wind, but because the space around it had been transformed. Behind the cabin, where his grandfather's storage shed had sagged under decades of neglect, a new structure stood. Not large, not grand, but solid and intentional, built by hands from every direction. Jed Thornberry had framed it. Declan's students had painted it. Mrs. Cormack had insisted on curtains for the windows because she believed that even animals deserved to look out through something that suggested someone cared. The fenced enclosure around the structure held space enough for the dogs that had been recovered from the Holloway facility, 23 of whom had been placed in temporary foster care through a network Claire had organized with veterinary clinics across 3 counties, and 12 of whom remained at Pine Hollow under Claire's direct medical supervision while they recovered from conditions that required more time and patience than any foster home could provide. Among them were dogs whose bodies bore the same marks Sable had carried on the night Ethan found her. Wire scars, collar grooves, the particular thinness that comes from being fed enough to produce, but never enough to thrive. Ethan had carved the sign himself. He had taken a plank of pine from the pile Declan brought on, the first day sanded it smooth over the course of an evening, while Ghost lay beside him, and Flicker chewed on a piece of rope she had stolen from the supply shed, and with a chisel and a steady hand, he had cut the letters into the grain with the same precision he had once applied to very different tasks in very different places. He mounted it at the entrance to the fenced enclosure on a Saturday morning in early March, driving the nails with firm, even strokes, while Claire held the plank level and Declan stood back to confirm the alignment, and Mrs. Cormack supervised from a folding chair she had brought specifically for the purpose of supervising. Those who had served recognized the name without explanation. The second watch is the middle of the night, the hours between midnight and dawn, when the darkness is deepest, and the temptation to sleep is strongest, and the duty to remain alert is most critical. It is the watch that tests endurance, the watch where discipline matters more than daylight, the watch that separates those who hold their post from those who surrender to the weight of the dark. Ethan did not explain the name to anyone who did not already understand it. He did not need to. Declan Pryor kept his house. The investigation into Rennick's financial activities revealed the pressure applied through the bank's investment structure, and the resulting regulatory scrutiny prompted First Mountain Savings and Loan to restructure Declan's loan under fair terms. He signed the new papers at the kitchen table, where Margaret's lavender soap still faintly scented the air, and sat for a long time holding them, because holding something that is no longer being taken feels different from holding something you never feared losing. He began bringing his history students to the Haven on Saturday mornings. They cleaned enclosures and carried water and learned the names of dogs that were learning slowly and cautiously to trust hands that reached toward them without pain attached. Declan told Ethan once, standing by the fence, while a student knelt beside a recovering female who had allowed herself to be touched for the first time, that Margaret would have loved this place. He said it simply without drama, the way a man speaks about someone he still talks to in his head every morning, and Ethan nodded because he understood that some statements do not require a response, only the respect of being heard. Claire expanded her veterinary practice to include regular rounds at the Haven, driving up the ridge 3 mornings a week with supplies in her truck, and Mr. Pemberton, the ancient tabby cat, riding in a carrier on the passenger seat because the cat had developed a habit of yowling inconsolably when left alone at the clinic, and Claire had decided that the path of least resistance was simply to bring him along. Mr. Pemberton would sit on the porch railing and watch the dogs in the enclosure with the regal disapproval of a creature who believed the entire operation was beneath him, but was unwilling to be excluded from it. Willa Kershaw brought the first non-canine resident. A small orange kitten, 8 weeks old, one ear slightly bent from a healed injury, found near the old rail yard and carried to the Haven in a cardboard carrier held against her chest with both hands. Claire examined the kitten and declared him malnourished but otherwise intact, and they placed him in a small warm space inside the shelter where he immediately fell asleep. And Willa laughed with a brightness that cut through the lingering gravity of the preceding weeks, like sunlight through cloud cover. Ghost and Sable had settled into a partnership that required no training and no commands. They patrolled the perimeter of the Haven in tandem, Ghost slightly ahead, and to the right in the formation he had maintained since Kandahar, Sable slightly behind, and to the left, with her healed leg bearing weight. Without hesitation, her gait strong, and measured her black and tan coat, gleaming in the spring light, with a health that had returned to her body over weeks of care and rest, and the particular nourishment that comes from being safe. They moved through the enclosure together, checking on recovering dogs with the composed authority of 2 animals who had both known suffering and had both decided that their remaining purpose was to stand between vulnerability and harm. Flicker had grown into her legs. No longer the trembling scrap of fur Ethan had lifted from beneath her mother on a frozen road. She was strong and fast and fearless. Her dark coat fully defined the pale streak across her chest, flashing when she ran, which was constantly. She chased Ghost with relentless optimism, ambushed Sable's tail with attacks that were impressive and futile, and had recently discovered that Mr. Pemberton could be provoked into swatting at her from the porch railing, a game she found endlessly entertaining, and the cat found endlessly beneath him. On a quiet evening in the second week of March, Mrs. Edith Cormack sat on the porch beside Ethan while the last light stretched across the valley and the haven hummed with the soft sounds of animals settling into the routines of safety. She had brought pie. She always brought something. "You know," she said, watching Ethan mount the last screw on a new gate hinge he had been installing, "my Edmund used to say that a town is only as good as the smallest thing it is willing to protect." She paused and looked out at the enclosure where a German shepherd who had arrived unable to stand was now walking in cautious circles, testing legs that were remembering what they were for. "I think he would have liked what you built here." Ethan tightened the screw and tested the gate's swing. It moved smoothly and latched firmly. "I did not build it," he said. Mrs. Cormack looked at him with blue eyes that saw more than they were given credit for, and smiled. "No," she said, "but you stopped on the road, and that is where it started." She folded her hands in her lap. "You think you happened to drive up that mountain the night of the storm. I do not think that. I do not believe in accidents of that kind. I believe someone placed you on that road at that moment because that mother and her baby needed exactly what you had to give." She looked at him. "And you needed exactly what they had to give you." Ethan did not respond with words. He looked at Sable, standing near the fence line, her amber eyes watching the valley with the calm vigilance of a dog who had found her post and intended to hold it. He looked at Ghost, lying on the porch with his chin on his paws, amber eyes half closed, but ears still working, still cataloging, still on watch. He looked at Flicker racing across the yard with her chest streak flashing like a signal fire that refused to go out, and he nodded, once, slowly. The nod of a man who was not yet ready to say what he believed out loud, but who had stopped arguing against it in the privacy of his own silence. Claire came around the corner of the cabin carrying a crate of medical supplies, and she set it down on the porch and stood beside Ethan, and their shoulders touched in the way that had become habitual without ever being discussed, and neither of them moved away. The valley below held the last gold light of evening. The mountains beyond were turning the color of things that endure. 3 weeks later, on an evening when the air carried the first true warmth of the approaching season and the pines smelled of resin and new growth, a vehicle Ethan did not recognize appeared on the ridge road. A gray pickup, older model, traveling slowly. It parked at the edge of the clearing and a young man stepped out. Late 20s, thin, wearing a jacket that had a military cut but no insignia. His eyes had the particular emptiness that Ethan recognized instantly because he had seen it in his own reflection for 2 years. The look of someone who has come back from somewhere that took more than it returned. The young man stood beside his truck for a long moment, looking at the sign above the gate. Second Watch Haven. He read it twice. Then he looked at Ethan on the porch, and at Ghost, Rising to his feet beside him and at Sable, standing near the fence with her head raised, and at Flicker, who had stopped running and was watching the stranger with her head tilted in the way puppies watch things they have not yet decided to be afraid of. "I heard," the young man said, and his voice cracked on the first word and steadied on the second, "that this is a place where things that are broken can rest for a while." In the crook of his left arm, pressed against his chest, was a dog. Small, brown, trembling, one ear torn, ribs visible through thin fur, eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes from knowing what hands can do, and not yet knowing that some hands are different. Ethan descended the porch steps. Ghost followed at his right. Sable watched from the fence, Flicker pressed against her mother's leg, and Ethan Mercer, who had spent 2 years driving past every reason to stop, who had learned on a frozen mountain road that courage sometimes looks like a starving dog shielding her puppy with her own dying body, who had discovered in a cabin on a ridge that the darkest watch before dawn is not survived alone, but endured together. Walked across the clearing toward a stranger carrying a broken animal and said the only word that mattered. "Come in." The gate opened. The young man stepped through. Ghost circled once, assessed, accepted. Sable lowered her head in greeting. Flicker bounced forward with the fearless curiosity that had defined her since the night her heart stopped and started again in the palm of a man who had almost kept driving. And the cycle of healing, which had begun with a single choice on a single night in a single storm, continued. Because that is how grace works, not in thunder, not in spectacle, but in the ordinary miracle of one wounded soul stopping for another and finding in the act of rescue the thing they did not know they were searching for. The second watch was over. Morning had come.